Hey guys, what's up? My name is Laura. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about underwater photography. Now, if you follow me on social media, you know that I am obsessed with creative photography effects, and underwater photography and things like droning are such awesome techniques to learn that can really explode your creativity and allow you to come up with awesome images. So specifically today, we're going to be talking about a subtype of underwater photography shots called split screen photography, or half underwater, half above water shots. So I'm going to break it down and first talk about the gear that you're going to need to achieve this type of shot, and then I'm going to talk about my top 6 tips for mastering this technique. Before we dive in, if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe to my channel, smash the like button on this video. I would really appreciate it. Okay, so let's dive in and talk about gear. Now, there are a couple different options for split screen, half underwater, half above water shots. Let's start with the most expensive and move down to the cheapest. So the first option that you're gonna have is to buy underwater housing for your SLR camera. Now, just for an example, if you have a 5D Mark II, underwater housing for that's going to run you about $1,700. So this is, like I said, definitely a more expensive option. However, this is going to be the highest quality option. So if you've already played around with underwater photography and you know you like it, I would definitely splurge for this option. If you've not played around with underwater photography at all and you're very new to it, definitely get a cheaper option, see how you like it, and then you can always go from there. Okay, so next up, let's talk about the setup that I currently use, which is the Olympus Tough with underwater housing and a dome port. So this is what the camera itself looks like. It is basically a glorified point and shoot camera. This thing is waterproof, so this can go underwater by itself, and it's also shockproof, which means it's really hard to break, very rugged, and that's perfect for someone like me who loves to go on adventures and sometimes puts my equipment in sort of precarious situations, if you know what I mean. So this is the housing and the dome port that I use with my Olympus Tough. It actually goes in the back here. And one thing to note about it is, if you look on the back, you can see that this does have a bunch of different buttons so that you can actually make adjustments to the camera while you're underwater. I would definitely look into whatever you're buying and making sure that you have that option, because this thing is stays sealed and airtight. I mean, with a camera like mine, obviously it's an underwater camera on its own, so you could probably open it up, but trust me, when you're out there in the water getting rocked by waves and all this stuff, you want to be able to quickly and easily make adjustments to your camera without having to open something like this back up. So this is the dome port that goes on the front of it. It does screw on and off, so it is an attachment. It does come with this underwater housing. I'm going to talk more about this dome port because this is an essential part of taking split screen shots. If you don't have this, you're basically not going to be able to take split screen shots. But let's just finish up and talk about 2 other options for you guys. That would be GoPro and iPhone. Now, GoPro would be the next option down as far as cost. GoPros are obviously well known for underwater photography. You know, they come with an airtight case. They're wide angle, which makes them very good for underwater photography because you're trying to capture 2 scenes at once, and wide angles, you know, you're able to capture a lot in one frame. They're very small, which is also really nice. And you can get an underwater housing unit for GoPro for about $50 to $60, which is really inexpensive. My setup, the camera itself cost about $500, and then the underwater housing and the dome port, I think, was an additional like $300. So GoPros are, you know, they definitely do the trick. Obviously, they can be used in a lot of other situations as well. And I have one underwater housing. I don't personally use it, even though I do have a GoPro. I'm thinking about purchasing because I've heard great things about it. So definitely go check that out. I'm going to list all the gear that I use and everything that I talk about below. So I'll list that for the GoPro as well. The last option is they're actually making underwater cases and dome ports and lenses for iPhones. I wouldn't recommend those just because the dome ports on those are really small, and therefore it's hard to achieve this effect. In order to understand why, let me explain a little bit more about the camera. So as you can see on this Olympus Tough, this is where the lens is right here. And in order to get a good split screen shot, you need the water line to be right in the center of this image. Now, if you're in an ocean, okay, maybe a pool would be a little bit easier, but let's say that you're in an ocean where most of the coolest split screen photography shots are taken and the waves are just like going like crazy. You can't see the front of your camera, right? Because you're shooting like this and looking at the back of the screen. It's really hard to get that waterline right in the center of this. But if you upgrade to this setup, all of a sudden you've increased your surface area using this dome port. So the water is going to be going up and down in here, and it's way easier to get the water line in the center of this dome port or somewhere on this dome port than it is on that little camera. So you're definitely going to need a dome port for this. That's pretty much all I'll say on gear. Like I said, I'll list everything in the description below so that you can check out what option would work best for you. Now let's go ahead and talk about my 6 tips for taking really awesome half underwater, half above water images. The first one is so easy. I wish that I figured this one out a little bit sooner. Okay. It's pertaining to horizontal versus vertical images. So if you are taking a horizontal image, which is kind of like our go-to most of the time, it's really hard to get that waterline smack in the middle of the shot. If the waterline's a little bit too high, you basically are like, you're only seeing a fraction of what's above water. And if the waterline's too low, the same thing, but vice versa. And that's the whole point of the shot. So it just takes a lot of trial and error in order to get that right. Now, if you change your camera to take a vertical image, look how much more wiggle room. You have such a larger margin for error of getting that waterline in the right spot. In fact, even if the waterline's a little bit high, you'll still be able to crop post-process and get that waterline somewhere in the middle of the image, and you have so much more room to play with to capture both above water and below water, whatever's going on there. So definitely practice with vertical shots. So much easier to get right. All right, the second and third tip both pertain to camera settings. Now, as we talked about, there's a lot of different setups that you can use for this, and some of them might not have manual mode. Okay, some of them might be point and shoot cameras like this, but I am going to cover it because a lot of point and shoot cameras, you can change the aperture on, and even iPhones these days, you can literally change your aperture on an iPhone. I have an iPhone 11 and I realized that the other day and I was like mind blown. So they're incorporating this technology in, you know, basically the most basic of cameras, so it's really worth understanding. Okay, so as you guys know, aperture controls your depth of field. Depth of field, if you have a wide depth of field, that means that either your background or your foreground is going to be blurry. So not your entire image is not going to be sharp. Whereas if you have a narrow depth of field, then everything in your image is going to be sharp. Now, in a situation like split screen photography, which do you guys think that you would want to use? You would want to use a smaller aperture because we're taking 2 different images basically at a time. We're trying to capture 2 different scenes at one time. We'd like for them to both be relatively sharp so that the viewer can see what's going on in both. That being said, underwater, a lot of light doesn't get down there. So a lot of the time we do have to open our aperture up more, because if we use a small aperture, which is where you get a very sharp image all around, less light gets let in because it's a small hole that you're letting light through. Whereas when you open your aperture up, that's great because more light gets in. However, it's also going to create some blur in either the background or the foreground. So if you can, stop your aperture down. If you can't, if your camera uses automatic settings, or if you have to open your aperture up because it's darker underwater and you need to brighten your image up, then be cognizant of where you're focusing on. It's all about being intentional, okay? Obviously, if your aperture is wider open, part of your image is going to be blurry. So think about what part of this image is cooler. Like, what do I really want the people to see? Are you snorkeling off the Rosario Islands in Colombia and there's like all these tropical fish and beautiful coral like swimming below the surface? Obviously, you're going to want that to be in focus. There may be a boat above the water, which is cool, but like everyone's seen a boat before in a picture. Like what's underneath is a lot cooler. Whereas if, you know, underwater there's basically just sand, and above water there's like a beautiful landscape of Positano, Italy or something like that, maybe you want to focus up there, and it all depends on the situation. I'll give you an example of this. I was swimming off the coast of New Zealand, and the water was really opaque. It was beautiful color, bright teal, but it was really, really opaque. And my friend was standing above in front of a cave making a cool pose. Now there was nothing to see underwater because the water was really, really murky. So I chose to focus on her. If her and the water were both out of focus, then the entire shot just looks like not intentional. Everything's out of focus and there's nothing for the viewer to really see. You always want to focus on the subject of your image, whatever that is. So definitely be intentional about your settings, be intentional about your focus point. And just like another fun tip for you guys, if you can adjust your aperture, but you do want to keep it more closed down so that the entire image is sharper, try bumping your ISO up. That's your, controls the sensitivity to your camera's sensor, and you can play around with that, and that will allow you to keep your aperture a little bit more closed. Just be careful not to bump it too high because it will introduce noise into your image. Okay, so let's go on to my fourth tip, and that is around conditions. Now, obviously this isn't something you have control over, but this is something that you should think about when you're packing your gear up for a trip or for a day adventure or whatever it is. The best conditions are made up of three things for split underwater photography shots. You want a sunny day, you want calm water, and you want clarity or clear water. If one of those things is off, it's going to be harder to get cool split screen images. The sunnier it is, the more closed down you can keep your aperture, and just the more illuminated everything underwater is going to look. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities to take pictures of marine life, or maybe you're shooting with a model. It always just really brightens the image up and brings a lot of depth to the image when it's sunny out. Clarity of the water is also really important. Obviously, if you have really clear water, you're able to see really far out, and it could illuminate, again, marine life, coral. It's just awesome when you can see far. If the water's really murky or opaque, there's really nothing to see. You probably can't even see your own feet. So it's not going to be that cool, right? And then lastly is calm. This is probably the most important aspect. Like we talked about when we talked about getting the water line right across here, it's hard to do even in calm water. Keep in mind, the ocean obviously is moving constantly, and you're out there, you got this big bulky camera, the waves are like throwing you around, and you're trying to capture the water at the exact right moment. So if you're dealing with a really choppy surf, honestly, forget about it. It is impossible. You're going to take hundreds of images and maybe end up with one that's halfway decent. Whereas if the water is calm, it's a lot easier to line your shot up and get an awesome shot. So think about that. If you want to practice this, bring out the gear when it's appropriate. Intentionally book day trips and things if you want to practice this, where you're going to deal with calm water. Like tropical water is always a go-to because it's sunny, the water is typically calm, and it's also typically very clear. Okay, so my next tip kind of relates to this, and that is more of a mindset tip than anything, but you have to be patient with any type of underwater photography, especially with this technique. I really respect all the creators that I know that are awesome at underwater photography, because I think that it's the hardest type of photography, honestly, to get good at. Anyone can take a good shot with a drone. Once you know your way around an SLR camera, it's really not a hard thing to get a good shot. But underwater photography is really challenging. There's so many different conditions and factors to take in mind. I mean, obviously humans can't hold their breath, so you have that going on. You might have snorkel gear, scuba gear. You have all of this bulky stuff. You can't change the settings easily. You're trying to swim at the same time. You're trying to take pictures of fish, and they're darting away from you. It's challenging, and this technique especially takes patience. So be patient with yourself. Lower your expectations a little bit. Whereas in normal photography, you might take 1 out of every 3 shot might be a really usable image, maybe higher than that if you're really experienced, or maybe lower than that. But with this technique, I would hazard to say that 1 in 20 images is actually going to be maybe a usable image, maybe even higher than that. It's definitely a challenging technique. So be patient. Know the conditions that this is going to work in, and don't burn yourself out right away. And then my last tip would be to prep before you go in the water. Obviously, I sometimes hate when people give this tip, because it's obviously charge your camera battery. Obviously that's a no-brainer, but you know what? When you're on dry land and you forget to pop a memory card into your camera, you just go back into your bag, put the memory card in, and you're good to go 30 seconds later. But if you've just swum out 20 yards into the ocean, you got your model out there, you got everything set up, and then you realize that your battery's dead, or there's no memory card in your camera, or the settings aren't right, you're getting rocked by waves, and you're out there, you can't stand, whatever the situation is, it just sucks a lot more when you're doing underwater photography, trust me. So make sure that you get your camera set up in your housing. Make sure that this seal is completely airtight. Make sure all of your settings are you know, you might have to adjust them, so I don't want to say that they're correct, but make sure that your settings are on something that you think is going to work pretty well, so you only have to make minor adjustments. Make sure your camera is charged and make sure your memory card is in. I do this all the time, so it's literally like I should be taking my own advice, but I hope that that helps you guys. Definitely let me know how this goes. I would love to see some of your shots. If you're not already subscribed, please subscribe, like this video, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Everyone makes fun of me for how I say water, and I just said it like 10 million times. That's really annoying. What are you supposed to say? Water? What are we, British? Go in the water.